The nut was so good I passed out and woke up in the shower. My girlfriend and I have been dating for 2 years now. We have always been very active in the bedroom. Both of our problems stem from the fact we take a long time to finish. We always try to spice things up with toys and it definitely gets the job done, but it never manages to transfer us to an alternate reality like a 10 out of 10 intimate experience can. We were recommended an aphrodisiac chocolate from a friend and ordered it. We agreed not to touch each other until the chocolate arrives and maybe it will deliver something outstanding. When the chocolate arrived, my girlfriend and I were very excited. We ate the chocolate in the evening and roughly 2 hours later we got into bed. By the time we did I could barely contain myself and so could she. I threw her onto the bed and this got her going like putting gasoline onto a fire. We made out for a few minutes and she started going down on me before popping some sour candies. She has done this in the past and it delivered great results but nothing otherworldly. This time however, not only did my toes curl, I was literally drooling. I ended up finishing about 10 minutes later, 10 minutes which felt like eternity. As I was finishing, she kept going. This chocolate made me super sensitive. My vision literally went white and I lost my ability to speak as my girlfriend was at the point of suffocation but would not stop. After I finished, my legs shook for a good 15 minutes and I was breathing like I had just ran a marathon. My eyes were rolling back and the whole time she kept softly massaging. I bust again, and then woke up in the bathroom, in the shower with her. She claims I passed out and as I looked up she said she felt the aphrodisiac chocolate was destroying her and was using her adult toy in the shower. I ended up helping her, and afterwards she slumped and I had to carry her into the bedroom where we both went 2 more rounds. She woke up with a sore abdomen and thighs the next day and we both agreed this chocolate is the best purchase we have ever made. We have been using this chocolate for about a month and I end my night by drooling constantly. 100% would recommend. Am I the a-hole for getting mad at my girlfriend for pulling a naked prank on me? I had a girlfriend of 8 months who I recently went on what was supposed to be a week-long beach trip in Queensland with her friends and family. She had been planning this trip for a long time and was looking forward to it, especially since I'd had the chance to get to know them all. On the 3rd day we planned to go river rafting. When we got there I was looking through my bag before I went to change and couldn't find my trunks. I instead found a new navy blue pair. When I told her this, she replied with, "Oh yeah, that's the extra one I packed in case you lost yours." I thought this was thoughtful. I changed into them and we all headed down towards the river. We all got into our tubes and started floating off. About 3 minutes and I feel my suit getting baggier, and I even notice a piece is falling off. I was disappointed that they were a cheap pair but I kept going. Once we hit the rapids it got real though. I felt a sudden rush of cold water and I noticed my trunks had been torn clear off by the water. I stood up covering myself with just the last piece. Everyone else, about 15 of her friends and family, started to laugh. I was absolutely horrified. One of my biggest fears is being naked in public, and now I was completely nude with no way to get back. I can't tell you how trapped and humiliated I felt. I had to spend the rest of the day with the water up to my shoulders, feeling awkward and embarrassed the whole time. Whenever we were in shallow water I was forced to stand up and walk exposed in front of them. They weren't prudish either. Her friends and parents made jokes and comments on my body as we went. Her young cousins made sure to comment on the shape and size of my junk when I couldn't cover myself also. When we got back to the beach I had to run covering myself back to my towel. My day was completely ruined. I felt humiliated and angry. When we got back to our room, I was back into clothes trying to forget the day when my girlfriend came in giggling to herself. She asked me if I liked the new swim trunks, and when I asked what she meant she told me she had ordered a prank dissolving pair online and replaced my other one with it. I was absolutely livid. She had purposefully exposed and violated me because she thought it'd be a good laugh. She even made sure not to pack another pair or a towel. I started yelling and she told me to calm down, saying that it was only a joke. I left that night, and I didn't call her the next day. She called screaming at me, acting like I was the one who had wronged her, saying that she had worked hard for this trip and that I was being immature. But I didn't want to be around someone who would humiliate me, especially considering that her own family and friends would be present. I can understand that I ruined the trip for her, but it feels like her own fault.
My son's teacher has been giving him some strange homework. His latest assignment was horrifying. I'm not a massive fan of homework, but it seemed like the homework that Mrs. Wagner always set quite simple tasks that could easily be completed in a night, for the most part. Initially, Dylan had to ask a parent and find out what their parents did for work and ask 3 questions about their job. But as time went on, I started to get scared. The homework began to get a little more personal. Every night, I would ask Dylan what his homework was for that night and then I would help him with it if he needed help. That's when I noticed the homework becoming a little bit strange. One night, on Dylan's 3rd week of being in the new class, he came home, looking upset. I asked him, when he entered the kitchen, what was wrong, and he told me that everything was okay. I could tell, though, that something was wrong, but he didn't want to tell me. Dylan spent most of the night in his room. We decided to let him stay there for a while, but after an hour or 2, I went in to see him and let him know that it was time to go to bed. I walked down to his room, opened the door, and when I looked inside, I saw that he had already fallen asleep over his workbook. I quietly walked over to him to gently wake him up and move him to his bed, but that's when I saw it. The homework task that was set for that night. The title that was written in Dylan's workbook was "Would I Miss My Parents If I No Longer Lived With Them?" At first I was taken aback. This was a very weird task to set for a group of 14 and 15-year-olds. I didn't really know how to react to this. I continued to read, though, to see what else he had written. He had written, "I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love them both a lot and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them. But I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to, like you were saying today, Mrs. Wagner. When I read the final sentence, I felt chills down my spine. The words struck me like a brick to the face. What had Mrs. Wagner been telling my son? What was the purpose of telling him these things? I decided, probably stupidly, not to tell my wife about what I had found. She would worry, and she probably had a right to worry, but I didn't want to concern her. I decided that I would instead confront Mrs. Wagner tomorrow and ask her about this strange homework task. The next day, I took Dylan to school like I normally do, except this time I got out and walked up to the classroom with him. I saw Mrs. Wagner, alone in the classroom, as I entered the room, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hey, how are you?" she said as I entered the classroom. "How is Dylan settling in?" She was dressed in a flannel skirt with a black jacket and her brown hair was slightly curled. I answered that he was settling in well, but I did have one or two concerns. She asked what they were, and so I explained. "I was just curious about the homework you set yesterday. The one about how much they would miss their parents? I am just concerned because it is a very strange and confronting thing to ask a group of 9th graders. I also noticed that Dylan wrote that he might have to love someone else if he had to, like you told him. I would really like you to explain that." I asked her, quite bluntly. "Oh, that," she replied as she let out a slight laugh. "Yesterday, I was teaching about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how that there are also other people that would be there to help them if they need it." I wasn't satisfied with this answer and was about to question her further, when suddenly a large group of school children entered the classroom. They were all walking in 2 rows. They all greeted Mrs. Wagner and greeted her one by one. They seemed very well behaved, almost too well behaved. I then saw Dylan take a seat next to one of the students, who was staring to the front of the classroom with their arms crossed. At the entrance of the rest of the class, Dylan's behavior seemed to change. He seemed to sit up a bit straighter and his eyes widened as he began staring at the rest of the class. I looked around and noticed that all of the students were staring at the same spot. All their eyes were pointed at Mrs. Wagner. Something didn't feel right, but I knew that Dylan needed to stay at school, and this was probably some sort of morning routine they had. I decided that I would pick Dylan up from school, though, and so I left work a little bit early and drove over to the school. When the bell rang, most of the kids came running and screaming out of the gate, apart from Mrs. Wagner's class. They all walked out in a line, walking in time. This disturbed me. I had never seen a group of students so well behaved, especially even after the school bell had rung. Dylan walked over to the car and hopped in. He didn't say anything and sat in his seat, staring straight forward. I asked him if he was okay, and he just gave me a blunt response, almost instantly. Yes. I drove him home, in silence, and when we got home and inside, Dylan went straight to his room and closed the door. I knew something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what. I decided to leave him alone until my wife got home and I would tell her everything that had been going on. She got home about half an hour later and I sat her down and explained everything that had been going on. She sat and listened and started to look more and more worried with every word I said. "Maybe I should go and talk to him. He might like that," she said once I had finished explaining everything. I agreed, and so she went into his room and I waited out in the lounge room for them to finish talking to each other. 15 minutes later, Dylan walked out of his room and into the lounge room. He was holding a small workbook and he said, "Can you help me with my homework, Dad?" "Of course, come and show me what you need help with," I replied. He held out the notebook and I took it out of his hands and read the homework task for tonight. Written on the top line of the page was one task. Research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic. I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt a sharp pain in my neck, and I looked down and saw the needle sticking out of the side of my neck. Dylan was holding the other end of the needle, a blank stare on his face. Everything started to go black and the last thing I remember seeing is Dylan staring down at me, as I lay on the floor. I don't know how long I was out, but I was awoken by my wife screaming and crying. I woke up, startled, as she continued to scream. "He's gone. Dylan's gone." She kept screaming. I looked up at her and the first thing I saw was the small pin prick that was on the side of her neck. She had been injected too. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to find my son. I tried my best to get up, but I think the drug hadn't properly worn off yet because I still couldn't move properly. I could move my arms, so I managed to get my phone out of my pocket and dial the police. I explained to them what had happened, and they said that they would send officers out and would begin looking for Dylan. I then noticed that it was already 9 in the morning, and so I decided to ring the school and see if Dylan had gone there. I dialed and a lady answered the phone. I asked if she had seen Dylan from Mrs. Wagner's class. "No, I am very sorry, but we haven't seen him today. In fact, we haven't seen anyone from Mrs. Wagner's class today, they are all absent." Which is very odd because Mrs. Wagner hasn't shown up for work either today, the lady on the phone said. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment. My wife had heard what the lady said, so she also just sat there in total silence. That was all 3 weeks ago and Dylan is still missing, along with Mrs. Wagner and the rest of his classmates. All the parents of the kids in Dylan's class have the same story. They were injected with something by their own children and when they woke up, their child was gone. No one knows where they went, but we all had the same questions. Were they all together? Was Mrs. Wagner with them? Was this all planned? Exactly a month after the kids disappeared, the parents of Dylan's classmates and I gathered for a meeting at the town hall. We needed to share our experiences, our fears, our guilt. But as we were sharing our stories, one parent, Mrs. Johnson, whose son was also in Mrs. Wagner's class, remembered a strange detail. Mrs. Wagner had often spoken about a cabin her family owned deep in the woods, about 50 miles north of town. The police had searched her home and nearby areas, but nobody thought to check the cabin. Armed with this new information, we immediately called the police and relayed the information. They promised to launch a search the next morning and advised us to stay home for our safety. We couldn't just sit and wait, though. A few of the other parents and I decided to take matters into our hands. We gathered flashlights, maps, and a few essentials, and in the dead of the night, drove towards the woods. We navigated the dense forest for hours, the silence broken only by the sound of rustling leaves and our pounding hearts. As the sun began to rise, we came across an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were boarded up and the paint was peeling off, but it was still standing. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the cabin. We called for our kids, praying they would hear us and respond. Instead, what greeted us was an eerie silence. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the creaking door of the cabin. What we found inside was beyond our worst nightmares. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in scribbled writing and drawings that looked like they were done by children. A detailed plan was sketched out on one wall, outlining a strategy for the children to inject their parents and make their way to the cabin. The plan was signed with Mrs. Wagner's name. As we frantically scanned the room, something else caught our attention. A stack of notebooks lay on a dusty table. The cover of each notebook had a child's name, the names of all the missing children from Mrs. Wagner's class. I picked up Dylan's notebook, my hand shaking. I flipped through the pages, filled with more strange homework assignments, notes, and ramblings that seemed to be instructions from Mrs. Wagner. The last page stopped my heart. It was a drawing made by Dylan. It showed all the children, including him, standing hand in hand with Mrs. Wagner. They were standing at the edge of what seemed like a cliff, all smiling. And under the drawing, Dylan had written one chilling line: how to eliminate your family, including yourself.
What's the biggest screw up you've ever had? I've been sending nude photographs of myself to my mother on an anonymous dating site. I'm 20 years old and painfully single. My friends are serial daters, and one of them had told me about this website for string-free quickies with strangers online. Sounded like a decent distraction. So I set up an account, putting a photograph of my six-pack and V-line on my profile. Within the hour, my inbox was flooded. There were a few women here and there who caught my eye. I had always been into women a little older than me, not too much, but maybe just enough. I found one. She was stunning. She had these thick, juicy thighs, and a bit of a pudgy stomach. I liked that. She texted me first, surprisingly. I messaged back immediately, burying my nose in my phone at dinner and replying to her message. She had written to me, "Hi there, winky face," to which I replied, "What's up?" Off to a great start, right? Me and this lady hit it off real well. We spent a week or two just chatting it up, getting to know each other, and I found I really enjoyed talking to her. She was super dope, and she knew how to get me hard. She knew just what to say. I'd never heard her voice, of course, but that wasn't the point. Eventually, the night came where we wanted to begin exploring our interests. And, coincidentally, each other. She asked me to send her a photo of my veiny hands. I was a bit confused, but I obliged. She liked it. She sent me a picture of her clothed breasts. I ate it up. I sent one back of my chest. She told me she loved it, so I sent more. Eventually, she sent me one of her butt. I showed her my sweatpants, how she was making me feel. Then she took her bra off, and she showed me her breasts. This was the most exciting experience I'd had in years. It wasn't until she sent me a photo of her lips that I realized something. She kind of looked a lot like my mother. I told her she had my mother's lips, as weird as that sounds, but there, honestly, was nothing behind it. Just a genuine, object observation. She asked me how old I was. I told her 20. She said, "That's funny, you know, because my son is 20. Cue the comedic silence. We kept going back and forth like that for a little while until we came to a consensus. I was her son. She was my mother. My mother was taking these nude photos of herself in the next room and I had gotten hard to them. We stopped texting immediately. It's been a few days, and neither of us have brought it up. I don't think I want to talk about it. Am I the a-hole for leaving my ex homeless? My ex and I are 29 years old and had been dating since we were in high school. We were in the midst of planning our wedding up until 2 weeks ago when I found out she was having an affair. One day when my ex was out, I noticed her dad had been spamming her with messages that showed up on her Apple Watch. I got curious, wondering if something might have been wrong, so I decided to check the messages, and that's when I realized it wasn't her dad. The messages were full of some guy expressing how excited he was to hook up with her later that night. She had named the guy she was cheating on me with dad on her watch in order to hide suspicion, and he had just blown her cover with his excitement. Before she got home, I decided to hide the watch, and when she got back she began searching for it, asking me if I'd seen it, to which I responded cluelessly, telling her I hadn't seen it all day and assumed she took it with her. I then purposely started becoming distant and she noticed. She started panicking, texting her best friend, telling her all about how she lost her watch and how I've been acting distant. She was worried I might have found out about her affair. Her best friend had the decency to message me later on in the day, warning me that my ex was having an affair and that she'd be confessing to me in a few weeks. I told her that I already knew because I had her watch and I was watching the messages roll in. I also told her that I would be getting my revenge by the end of the month. Her friend said if I needed someone to lean on, she was always there and that she'd be willing to help me execute my revenge. A few weeks went by and our apartment lease was finally up, so I started packing everything. I also took all my money from our shared account. I woke up early the next day to throw all my stuff in my car and waited for her to get home so she could confess about her affair. When she did, I nodded and left without saying a word. As she was chasing after me asking where I was going, I said nothing and hopped into my car, getting ready to drive myself over to my brother's for the night. I woke up today to multiple messages and voicemails about why rent wasn't paid and why there was someone telling her she needed to leave. She had also decided to message my family, telling them all that she's homeless because of me and called me an a-hole. Nearly all my siblings and father agreed that she deserved what I did except for my sister and my mother. They also called me an a-hole for leaving her stranded and for taking half the money out of the account, but the only thing I took was the money I made. They said I should have tried to work things, and my mother even messaged me privately telling me that my fiancée was starting to have thoughts of ending her life, and that if I didn't take her back then she was going to disown me and cut me out of the will. I told her my ex was no longer my problem, and if she really was homeless then she could go live with that guy she destroyed our 13-year relationship for. Am I the a-hole for ditching this cheater? I've been getting freaky with my cousin and it feels so good. At the age of about 20, I was living the high life, incredibly fit, a martial arts instructor, and happy in every aspect of my life. Then, my cousin, a year and change younger than me, is moving into my parents' place for college. Shortly after finding this out, I lost my job. No reason was given. I felt screwed over. This cousin grated on my nerves when we were younger. Well, she's grown, all woman-like and whatnot. Mind you, I'd never had a girlfriend or anything, never played the game or any of that jazz, just been doing my thing, minding my business, and, till recently, enjoying my surrogate children, the ones I was teaching. Moving along, she comes in and we start connecting in ways I'd never connected with someone before. She was close enough to my age that I had someone that I could almost relate to. I was ecstatic. Then I started to notice strange behavior from her. She would get closer to me, lean on me, touch me, etc. Could have been friendly, if not that she wouldn't do it in front of my parents. That started the gears turning, and in the wrong direction. That's when I noticed that she was actually quite unbelievably hot. Little body, pretty face, adorable demeanor. So how does it go from her casually coming onto me, to full-blown playing around with each other? We were watching a movie in her room. She was complaining of a sore back. I offered a back massage, of course. I had done this for guys and girls alike, especially as an instructor dealing with people with back issues. So she lies on her stomach. I proceed to attempt to gently work out the knots, feeling her nice back through the flannel night shirt. She was a size A, so she didn't generally wear a bra to bed, so nothing to get in the way there. Then she asked if taking off her shirt would make things easier. My heart started pounding. I wasn't sure if I wanted to say yes because it really would make the job easier, or if I wanted to say yes because I wanted to see her beautiful back, and possibly chest, naked. Regardless, I said yes. I start working her back a little bit nicer, and eventually move up to her neck. Knowing the key and sensitive nodes, I started working those that would affect her more intimately. Soon, it became too much work to handle the neck while she was resting on her chest, so I recommended she get up and sit in front of me. We were on a bed. She did so, and I averted my eyes and handed her the shirt, button-up blouse, back. At this point all my hormones are shooting off, and probably have adrenaline running through me. Anywho, she puts the shirt on and faces away from me. I continue to work on the neck, massaging. Slowly, she started to move closer to me, leaning back further and further, until I realized that she didn't button up her shirt, and one breast was clearly hanging out. A beautiful perky little A-cup. Heaven. She was practically laying on me at this time, and I, scared, but oh so curious, started reaching down further and further, stroking the top of her chest and neck, and finally making it to her beautiful breasts. So soft and supple. She was reeling in the ecstasy of getting touched. Needless to say, things went downhill from there, and a semi-broken relationship that lasted about a year and a half ensued before she finally cheated on me, behind my back. I never penetrated her, but we did a lot of mutual touching, mouth stuff, and dry humping. She was my first real relationship, as much as that is, and to be honest she was kinda bad. They framed me. They fired me. And that's how they effed themselves into a divorce, a prison sentence, and a handful of deportations. I used to work at an upscale restaurant owned by a large corporate entity that owns several different restaurant brands. My role at that job was a little of everything. Since the day I started working there, I took it upon myself to learn as much as possible. I started as a server but eventually worked my way into different departments and job titles like carryout, hosting, bartending, and so on. Not long after, I started this position as the unofficial supervisor. I got a girlfriend, so I was also going out more often and spending money on her. With my position and some smart budgeting, I was able to afford all of this. Eventually, it was noted that our current general manager was going to be fired and replaced. The incoming general manager Harvey was supposed to be some rock star when it came to improving restaurants. We looked up his name and found him as the first search result on Google. But the entry wasn't some glowing review of his work ethic. It was a mugshot and a police report filed for repeated domestic abuse. Shortly after Harvey came, he started making major changes. Eventually, all but one manager was replaced, the kitchen manager Frito. Frito had been there since I had started working there. He seemed to be something of a chameleon, as his values and ethics seemed to change depending on who his boss was. Honestly, I sort of applaud his survival instincts, but ultimately see him as a suck-up and traitor. Harvey never really replaced the manager for our department, so we ran without a lot of oversight. Unless you count me as the supervisor, we didn't constantly have someone breathing down our necks about how things should be done. Our department had some hiccups here and there, but it still ran really smoothly. Since we did not have our own manager, we often had to radio for a manager to come help us out on things that needed a manager card for approval. Frito would always be the one to answer these calls since the kitchen was closest to our department. Over several months, Frito and I would butt heads dozens of times. He and I were constantly arguing about how important hours were to the workers in this department. Eventually, we had a meeting with Frito and all the workers in this department. The team suggested that I take over since I had already been supervising them and running things smoothly for the last several months. I could see at the moment it was suggested that Harvey and Frito made the decision on the spot that I had to be gotten rid of. I could see the look they gave each other and instinctively knew that my days at this place were numbered. One night I was scheduled as the closer. We had just returned from a massive catering event and there was an unbelievable amount of cleanup left to do for one person. When Frito came in and tried to send everyone except me home, I stepped up and told him that he was consistently breaking the promise he had made to keep 2 closers minimum. He looked me square in the face and told me to stop complaining about it, and if I was going to keep trying to talk to him about him breaking his promises, he could easily find someone who could work my shifts. I quickly realized that this was an assassination attempt on my job. He wanted me to press it further. So I backed off and started cleaning. I ended up having to stay way late, but that meant overtime pay anyway. I got a write-up for that since we aren't allowed to work overtime without a manager's approval. Complete BS. At work, we were allowed to have as much free soup and bread as we liked. So I would come into work 1 hour early every day so I could have some soup and bread for lunch before my shift. But on this day, when I walked into the kitchen to get myself some soup, one of the line cooks told me that he had a dish that had been cancelled after he cooked it, and Frito had told him to give it to someone. He assured me Frito had already comped it and that it was free to take for whoever wanted it. It just so happened to be my favorite appetizer, so I happily took the free food. Not long after I got to my booth, both Harvey and Frito approached me and asked me if I had put in a ticket for that food. I told them that the line cook had given it to me and said it was the cancelled order that Frito had already comped. Frito looked dumbfounded and said he had no idea what I was talking about. So Harvey told me, "I think you know that's theft. Go ahead and finish the food and then grab my stuff and go. That's the last meal you'll be having here." I tried to explain to them that I had been given this food by the line cook, but they refused to listen, so I offered to take them to the kitchen to clear it up with the cook. But by the time I had gone back to the kitchen with them to talk to the line cook, he had already gone home for the day. I had no choice but to gather my stuff, say my goodbyes, and head home. On my way out, I told the people working in my department that afternoon what had happened. They were shocked and angry, but mostly sad to see me go. I decided that on my way out, I would stop by the accounting office and pick up any tips that may have been dropped for me. Before heading down, I had the gut feeling to just set my phone to record, and I stuffed it into my pocket with the camera rolling. Although the video was entirely black since it was in my pocket, I did manage to get a pretty muffled recording of Harvey and Frito's voices through the door, discussing how things had gone as planned, and that they had been trying to get rid of me ever since the meeting with my department. I knocked on the door and they hushed up before opening it. They asked what I was still doing there, and I asked for my tips. They gathered what was in the safe for me and handed it over. Despite my anger rising at what I had just heard, I offered a handshake to both managers, thanked them for the opportunity to work there, and left. I made sure to pull my phone out of my pocket and record the front of the restaurant, with the sign showing its name and logo. On the train ride home, I sent some messages and made some posts on some local groups on Facebook saying that I had just been fired and that I was looking for a job as quickly as possible. By the time I got off at my stop, I had already set up an interview for the next day. During the interview, the manager mentioned he had already called my previous place of employment and spoken with the general manager, Harvey. Harvey had told him that I had been fired for theft. Luckily for me, the manager I was interviewing with asked me to tell him more about that, and he was willing to let me pull out my phone and find the recording. I asked if the voice in the video was the same as the one he spoke on the phone with. It was. That was confirmation enough for him that I hadn't made a fake video. He listened to the 2 managers in the video admit that they had set me up, and watched to the end when I showed the front of the restaurant, complete with the logo and name. The manager interviewing me, who will start calling Dean, hired me immediately and asked me to send him the recording. I did. I thought that was the end of it. About 7 months later, after settling into this job quite nicely, HR sent out a welcome all our new team members email. One of them, Thomas, was a former coworker who worked with me at the restaurant. We had worked at the host stand together, so I was pretty glad to see someone I knew and liked coming onto the team. I sought out his desk and went and said hello, and asked why he left the restaurant. He hadn't left willingly. He'd been laid off because the company was under investigation. The corporate entity that owned the restaurant chain had received an email with an attached video. My video that had been filmed from inside my pocket. That was cause enough for corporate to send someone to investigate internally. Thomas was pretty surprised that I hadn't heard anything about it, since there had been numerous attempts to get in touch with me. As soon as he said that, I logged into the old email I had used when I first applied for the job at the restaurant. I had at least 24 emails asking me to come in to discuss my employment and termination. I never replied. I just didn't care enough anymore. I'd also changed my number since then, so they hadn't been able to contact me by phone. Thomas continued explaining that before corporate had sent someone, Harvey and Frito had talked with my department and tried to offer them all a small pay increase to spin corporate a story about how I was incompetent at my job and failed to live up to my duties. The day the corporate auditor showed up, there had been a small exodus of people from my old department. They quit on the spot, in front of the lady from corporate Audrey, and made sure to rat out Harvey and Frito before leaving. Strike one for both of them. A couple of days after, Audrey showed Harvey and Frito the recording that had kicked all of this off. They denied it vehemently, but there was no mistaking Harvey's voice. It was clear they needed to be separated, so Audrey sent Frito to work at another restaurant owned by our parent company and temporarily demoted Harvey to manager. This tore them apart. They had once been an inseparable evil team, but the pressure of the investigation must have pushed them over the edge. They ended up at each other's throats, on Facebook, on a public post on the company page. Frito had been pictured in the Facebook post on the restaurant page, and Harvey made a passive-aggressive comment about how Frito shouldn't even be in the picture since it had been moved to another restaurant due to misconduct. The post was deleted, but not before it had been seen by Audrey the auditor. That was officially strike 2. Strike 3 came the next day when Audrey started interviewing the female waitstaff and bartenders, seeing if any of them could confirm that Harvey had tried to make a move on them. All of them were interviewed separately, and several of them had similar stories. Every girl that confirmed Harvey had made a move on them all said he had offered to be their sugar daddy if they would send pics or stay after closing to fool around with him. Harvey was fired. But that isn't the worst of it. Audrey the auditor wasn't just some random woman from corporate. She was the old regional manager for this area and had personally hired Harvey's wife as the general manager of another restaurant in the city. So she called up the restaurant Harvey's wife worked at and told Harvey's wife everything she had learned from the female waitstaff. We learned later that they had gotten a divorce over him trying to cheat on her after she'd already given him a second chance to change after he had beat her. I don't know what compelled her to give him a second chance after something like that, but she sure didn't give him a third. After firing Harvey, the line cook who had given me the food was interviewed by Audrey. I don't know how it came up, but at some point, he had let it slip that he was an illegal immigrant. She had his file in her hand, with an Illinois ID and social security number on file, so this confused her and she pressed him for more information. It turns out that Frito had some connections and had his own miniature black market going on where he would have faked social security cards and IDs made for the illegal immigrants he was hiring at reduced wages. Needless to say, this is a felony. With the potential PR nightmare that she was likely dealing with, she felt she had no choice but to alert the authorities. Local PD enlisted the help of the FBI since some of the evidence led them beyond the jurisdiction of the local police. Frito was arrested and quickly gave up the names of the people working that he had sold social security cards and IDs to. I'm not sure if he gave up all of them, but he did name drop about 14 people, and of those 14, at least half were deported by the time Thomas had been let go. One of them was the line cook that had given me the food the day I was fired. Thomas went on to explain that it had all started with me being fired, but I never sent that recording to corporate. I'd only sent it to Dean when he hired me. I asked him about it, and he told me he had sent it to his wife since she was a lawyer. He wanted to see if I had a case to maybe sue my old job since what they had done was wrong. But he also remembered that when we had first talked about it, I had said I'm not the type of person who would try to make millions off an entire company because of the mistakes of two jerks. But I'd also said that it would be pretty sweet to see them lose their jobs too. My wife cheated. We worked it out. Should I feel guilty if I want to leave now? Just over 2 years ago my wife cheated on me with a coworker at her work's Christmas party out of town. She told me immediately the morning after. To say I was devastated would be an understatement. This happened pretty much immediately prior to our country going into lockdown, so we were stuck together. I was in a bit of a daze at the time and just kind of went through the motions. I was angry and miserable, but also wanted to understand why she would do it. Hence it made sense to work through it at the time, seeing as we were seemingly stuck together. To her credit though, she did everything possible to make it right. She quit her job, cut off all contact with the coworker, offered to go to therapy/counseling and even admitted to what she did publicly. I never asked her to do this and her mother and sister are very close to her and were appalled. She became much more loving and considerate and even offered to let me sleep with someone else. I was actually upset with this suggestion, but she was only saying it out of desperation. Fast forward to now, 2 years later, and by all accounts things feel like they're back to normal again. At least for her. She's no longer moping around the house, stepping on eggshells in conversation, breaking down when anything regarding cheating happens. She started crying while we were watching a soap where a wife cheats on her husband. Unfortunately, I feel like this return to normalcy has reopened the wound. I think about that night more these days than I did during the previous 2 years. I don't know why, but I think that society returning to a bit of a pre-2020 state has made me feel like I've gone back in time to that evening. I can't stand to look at her anymore. Not in a she disgusts me way, but in more of a why are you still even here kind of way. I feel guilty for wanting to leave now after all the work she put in, even though logically I know I shouldn't. I feel like I'm the bad guy for wanting to end the marriage after the work she has put in. I know people will be able to easily say she made her bed etc., but I'm still really struggling with the idea of leaving her, for her sake. I don't hate her for it, but I don't think I love her anymore and I know this will destroy her. Part of me wishes I was strong enough to have left when it happened. Anyone been in a similar situation or have any advice? Thanks in advance. Update, thanks to everyone who commented on my previous post. I was surprised how much people cared about my benign marriage problems, but it helped me a lot. I checked this account out today to see what the responses were since last week and was taken aback by the number of people who wanted an update. The day after I posted I talked to my wife and laid out my feelings. I mentioned some of the points that people in my previous post had articulated very well that resonated with me. I told her whilst I had forgiven her I was struggling to forget what happened, and the fact we were seemingly going back to normal had triggered something in me and now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I said that whilst I do appreciate all the work she put in to try and save our marriage, I couldn't continue anymore. I mentioned a point that someone on my previous post said, that whilst we were in lockdown it almost felt easier to just ignore the issue to some degree as I would always know where she was or what she was doing. But recently, for the first time since it happened, she's going into town and visiting friends and my mind is just running at 100 miles per hour while she's out. Who is she with? Why is she slightly late home etc., and I haven't had to confront these feelings before. She cried, I cried, she begged me to stay, I cried again. We spent what felt like hours just sitting together in the living room not speaking at points. She asked the same questions multiple times. Do I still love her? Will we ever see each other again? Is there anything we can try to make this work? I think eventually she was doing it to delay the inevitable. She's now staying at her mom's house and I'm going to file for divorce. I know it's easy to lay all the blame at her feet when you're on the outside looking in, but I feel just as bad today as I did the day I found out what happened. I am heartbroken again and know full well I'm going to question myself if I've made the right choice. You can tell me it is the right choice all you like, there is no way I will ever be sure this was the right choice. There are no winners with this shit. Everyone is miserable, everything sucks, and I'm here reliving the most painful experience of my life for the benefit of a bunch of internet strangers who probably only want to read about the drama, and have no reason to care about me personally. I don't mean to come across as bitter, I had lots of genuinely supportive comments on my previous post. I'm just really struggling right now. I won't be using this account or responding here again after this post. Thanks to everyone who commented on my previous post. Am I the a-hole for telling my girlfriend that she isn't the hot girl anymore after she told me that the only reason she dated a guy like me is because she has a kid? My 29 girlfriend, 29, and I have been together for 10 months. She has a son from a previous relationship. Father is not involved, who is 5 years old. For the past 3 months we have been arguing a lot about money. When we first started dating I made a lot more than her. I made $112,000 a year and she made $40,000 a year, so in our relationship therefore I paid for the vast majority of the expenses and I encouraged her to use the money she saved to pay off her debt, and I even helped pay off her debt. Our relationship got much worse after I helped her out with her career. One of my cousins is high up in the state government and got her a nice job as a contractor to the state government. Her salary went up to $78K a year and she is able to work from home as well. My girlfriend started using her new money to just buy a lot of luxury items. Every time I would come to her apartment, she would have boxes. She spent a ton of money on clothes for her son. I was like, okay, sure, celebrate for a little bit then, but let's get back to responsible budgeting. However, her spending habits got worse. She took her new salary to get new credit cards and then also started buying stuff on Affirm and Klarna. We argued a lot about this and I decided to just give up on this. I was going to stop giving her advice on money unless she explicitly asks. But the problem is she wants me to still pay for everything like I did when she made $40K a year. She wants me to drive her car so I can pay for her gas when we do stuff together, and says I should take her and her son on vacation, pay for it all as well. For her son's birthday she had me buy him a PS5, then said it was from the both of us. We got into a big fight and I told her that now that she makes more money, I was going to be spending less money on her. She then flips out and says that she could get any guy she wants, and she wouldn't have even dated a guy like me if she didn't have a kid. I asked her what she meant by a guy like me, and she is like the guys I dated before. You were tall, jacked, had tats, the guy other girls all wanted them. She said I should feel lucky that she even gave me a chance. I told her I don't know what delusions you have. I saw your old photos, yeah, you were the hot girl in your early 20s, but no one is looking at you now thinking you are that anymore. You were about to be 30, you were 30 pounds heavier, thought it was closer to 40 but didn't want to be mean, and look like a mom. Sorry to tell you, but no one is looking at us thinking, damn, how that guy got that girl. Well, you can imagine how well this went. She kicked me out of her apartment and told me to kilometers. I know what I said was a lot, but I didn't want this whole tone to be in the relationship that, oh, I have to keep buying her stuff because I am the unattractive person in the relationship. And that I should feel blessed she is even with me. I took a gap year and my dad disowned me. $3.9 million later, he's begging for forgiveness. I spent my entire childhood trying to get into Harvard University. By the time I was 18, I had published research, interned with 3 phone companies, won international competitions, and, by the end of senior year, I finally had my acceptance letter from Harvard. After hearing the news, my parents were ecstatic. But everything changed after I told them that I wanted to take a gap year. The reason for this decision was because I was finally old enough to understand that getting into a good college didn't actually guarantee anything. As someone who had excelled within the school system, I didn't have actual skills like communication and networking. At best, Harvard was going to lead me to working in a boring 9-to-5, where I'd hopefully make 6 figures. But, I wanted a more fulfilling life. I wanted to start my own company and brand, travel extensively, connect with people instead of studying with them, and live a proper life. Unsurprisingly, my parents were unhappy with my decision to take a gap year, but my dad allowed it so long as I spent that time actually creating a company. So, I did. For a month, I just read business books and watched videos. I ran practice simulations of starting a business and analyzed the market to figure out what high demand areas were unsaturated. My social media feed transformed exclusively into business guru content. This one guy, Robert Oliver, basically became a deity to me, and he helped me to not just change my approach to business but to alter my outlook on health, fitness, and character. And 6 months into my gap year, after I'd finalized my business model, had people helping me, and was even starting to meet with venture capitalist investors, I realized that I didn't want to just take a gap year, I wanted to stay in a gap year. Without having stepped foot on campus, I wanted to drop out of college. The chaos that ensued when I told my parents this was insane. Whatever joy I felt at getting into Harvard was offset by the insults, criticism, and verbal abuse my dad slapped me with over dropping out. He refused to accept my decision and finally told me that I wasn't going to have a home to come back to if I didn't go to Harvard. But when he forced me to choose Harvard or my company, him or myself, I chose myself. I got out of my house, lived with a friend, and spent the next 2 years building up my company. Under the meticulous advice of business and lifestyle gurus like Robert Oliver, my business thrived. There was a lot of luck involved, mainly due to a certain pandemic that made my business grow way faster than it usually would have, but now, my company has generated almost $4 million in revenue. I live in my own apartment in New York City, have a decently sized team, and am fully independent. Hearing about my success, my mother recently reached out to me, saying that she and my dad wanted to talk. Reluctantly, I accepted the invitation and went home, and when I went inside, I was stunned to see my father give me a hug before touching my feet. In my culture, touching feet when greeting someone is a sign of absolute respect. Elders never do it to someone younger, and I shuffled away from my dad on sheer reflex because I was so shocked that he would do that, but that action alone spoke more than words could. My parents asked me to move back in with them, but I decided to stay in the city. And it's been 3 years now, but we're all trying to reconnect and get better as a family. Harvard may have been easier on my dad's heart, but forging my own path changed my life, and definitely for the better. What was the most gut-wrenching thing your parents did to you? My parents never really wanted kids. I was an only child and pretty much an accidental pregnancy from what relatives have told me. My childhood was initially good, but after I started growing out of the cute and adorable phase, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked and had their own business that they started together. That business was their life, and I always came second to it. Any other close family members lived states away, and I barely knew anything about them until I was an adult. So, I had no other family around my entire childhood. I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays, by the time I became a teenager, were often spent without my parents as they'd just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas and sometimes even back to school shopping. After I turned 10, my parents no longer wanted to buy a tree at all. I had to convince my parents to buy a fake one that I could build up and then take apart later every year. When I turned 16, I asked my parents if I could work part-time for them at their business. They rejected me immediately and told me they didn't have any open spots. They may as well have just come right out and said they didn't want me there. After I turned 18, my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school and I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. Not long after high school ended, my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad who owns a truck. I ended up renting a cramped apartment and working retail. I had no real-life experience and no time for college. After just a few months, I got fired because my manager legitimately had it out for me and wrote me up for the stupidest things. I ended up going broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment. So I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents begging for help, but they refused to take me in. Not even for a little while to get back on my feet. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard during the winter. My friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was just a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to tell us at all. My guess is it was out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did. Eventually, they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details. Then they told me not to bother them ever again. Thankfully, I was able to call my grandparents from my father's side of the family. They were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant. After learning about my situation, my grandparents flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My parents didn't even see me off at the airport despite being invited to. I had zero contact with them for pretty much a decade. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. I'm told my parents were not happy to hear that. However, I figured it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents, I was able to afford community college. I got an associate's degree, got a decent job, and eventually, my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go, but I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 of its value and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My position at the time forced me to go away on the road periodically. As a result, I can end up away from home for weeks at a time. One day, in late 2020, I came home after being away for over 2 weeks. Upon arrival, I found a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call the police when I noticed the van had the logo from my parents' business on the side of it. All I felt was dread. My parents had broken in somehow and were living out of my home. On top of that, they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddy-buddy the moment I walked in. I told them to get the hell out, but they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore since they'd sold it to me when they retired. I told them they'd have known that if they were in any way involved in my life. But they threw me to the wolves 10 years prior with no life experience. We argued, and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door, and called the police. When the cops showed up, they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie. Unfortunately, I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors had no cameras either. As a result, it was my word against my parents over how long they'd really been there, and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told the police they had a verbal rental agreement with me, and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that. The police told me it was a family dispute, and to file eviction with the courts to get them out. Since this was in 2020, getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, my parents were squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face. From the information I got out of them, their business went bankrupt and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings, so they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father as a delivery driver, my mother as a sales associate. They were making money, and the only things they contributed to were electricity and water utilities. They basically just handed me a $100 bill every month and said I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives. They then told me to be thankful that they weren't demanding the money back for that time. When I argued back, they threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I was so at my wit's end that I ended up calling my grandparents to explain the situation to them. They were very unhappy and spoke with my parents, but they still said they had the right to stay in my home. They refused to budge. My grandpa told me he was sorry it had come to this and that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have invaded. I told him not to worry. I'd already filed for a legal eviction and would get it soon enough. I told him my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of them too. They responded with the silent treatment. My father was away most of the time driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking. My mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room. At one point, she even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom. She argued that they were my parents, and they deserved better. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better, and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. I didn't ask to be born, and it's a normal obligation for parents to raise their own children. I told her I knew they were trying to assert dominance to try and keep me from kicking them out. I let her know her time was coming soon enough. Finally, after 4 months and now into early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only needed to go to court because they fought the eviction and tried to gaslight me into rescinding it. They tried to use the fact that it was formerly my grandparents' house and attempted to use the $100 monthly payments as some sort of leverage. However, there was no real rental agreement, and they were smart enough not to forge one as that would have been fraud. In the end, the judge ordered that they needed to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they have zero claim on my house. After court, they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh. I called them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine was theirs, but they had no right to call themselves my parents because they've never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby, lying, and now broke narcissists to their faces, then told them to get their affairs in order. They knew I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they didn't leave my house when the 30 days were over. My father looked enraged, but my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He sneered at me and walked away. I just laughed in his face. They eventually left, but not without a lot of difficulty. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker. The exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left. What's even funnier is that they had been so convinced they could make me let them stay that they didn't bother to look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through. My mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and cramped studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. It was a lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once, and the apartment was terrible. The walls were baby barf green, and the carpet looked like it was 20 years old. The only window just had a view of a brick wall outside, and there was no dishwasher. The stove was the smallest one I'd ever seen, the toilet looked like it needed to be replaced, and the walls also did little to stop noise from neighbors. There were already 2 people loudly fighting in the adjacent apartment while we were there. My mother went out of her way to give me sad eyes the whole time. She tried dropping hints that I should be feeling guilty for reducing them to live in such a place. I just acted oblivious to it all until she finally stopped. They signed the lease right away and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also ended up demanding the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV from my guest room. I told them to just take the damn things because I no longer wanted them in the house after they spent 5 months sleeping in that room. They looked at me like I was treating them as though they were diseased and demanded nothing more. The moment they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. When the move was finally over, they watched me start ripping the old lock off the front door as they were getting into the van. They said nothing, I said nothing. They just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a massive sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I figured karma had finally come for them, and they could live under a rock for all I cared. But nope, my grandparents heard from them recently. They'd called them to brag about having a new business similar to their old one in the same state I'm living in now. Unfortunately, they are basically on track to being right back to where they used to be in life prior to the pandemic. I've already Googled their new business, and it seems like it's doing well. They have many positive reviews and everything. I'm pretty freaking resentful, truth be told. They put me through being homeless, squatted pretty much for free at my house for months, then went right back to being the snobby wine drinking business people they used to be. If karma is real, it's taking too damn long.